That seat isn't yours. The words would echo through Naomi Carter's mind long after the music stopped, long after the cameras disappeared, and long after an entire ballroom realized how wrong they had been. But at that moment, standing beneath the glittering lights of one of Manhattan's most prestigious charity galas, Naomi had no idea that a single sentence was about to change everything. The Grand Regency Ballroom shimmered with elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across polished marble floors. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays. Wealthy donors, politicians, business leaders, and celebrities filled the room with laughter and conversation. Every detail reflected power. Every detail reflected status. And tonight, status seemed to be the only thing anyone cared about. Outside the entrance, luxury cars continued arriving one after another. Camera flashes illuminated the red carpet while reporters eagerly documented the evening's guests. Inside, anticipation buzzed through the crowd. The Carter Foundation's annual gala was one of the most exclusive events in New York. Every year, it raised millions for scholarships, community programs, and educational initiatives across the country. More importantly, it attracted some of the most influential people in America. Near the center of the ballroom stood Ethan Carter. Tall, confident, and impeccably dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, the billionaire entrepreneur moved effortlessly through groups of investors and executives. People gravitated toward him naturally. Some wanted business opportunities. Others wanted influence. Many simply wanted to be seen standing beside him. Ethan greeted everyone with practiced ease. He smiled, shook hands, answered questions, accepted compliments. From a distance, he appeared completely at home. What most people failed to notice was the woman who entered several minutes later. Naomi Carter stepped quietly through the ballroom doors. She wore an elegant emerald gown that complemented her deep ebony skin. Her natural grace attracted attention without demanding it. Yet despite her beauty, few people approached her. Some guests glanced in her direction before quickly looking away. Others assumed she was simply another attendee. A few recognized her name but knew very little about her. To them, she was merely Ethan Carter's wife. Nothing more. Naomi had long ago become accustomed to that assumption. She walked calmly through the room, offering polite smiles whenever someone met her eyes. A familiar sense of distance surrounded her. Not loneliness, not sadness, something quieter, something she had learned to carry with dignity. For years, she had watched people admire Ethan while overlooking everything that existed beyond his public image. She never complained. She never competed for attention. She simply focused on the work that mattered. Tonight felt no different. At least not yet. Across the ballroom, another woman was attracting considerably more attention. Victoria Monroe stood near Ethan, surrounded by a small circle of socialites and donors. Young, glamorous, and effortlessly confident, Victoria seemed perfectly comfortable occupying the spotlight. Her silver gown sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Her laughter carried easily across nearby tables. And although nobody said it openly, many guests had already noticed how frequently she appeared beside Ethan at public events. Whispers followed wherever she went. Speculation had become its own form of entertainment. Victoria seemed to enjoy every second of it. Several guests smiled warmly as she spoke. Others appeared eager to impress her. The attention only strengthened her confidence. As Naomi continued toward the front of the ballroom, she noticed Victoria standing beside one of the reserved seating sections. Their eyes met briefly. Victoria's smile never faded, but something cold flickered behind it. The feeling disappeared so quickly Naomi almost questioned whether she had imagined it. Almost. Meanwhile, conversations throughout the ballroom continued revolving around one subject. Tonight's announcement. Nobody knew exactly what the Carter Foundation planned to reveal. Rumors had circulated for weeks. Some believed a major expansion was coming. Others expected a groundbreaking partnership. A few insiders hinted that the evening could alter the future direction of the foundation entirely. Whatever the truth was, curiosity filled the room. Even Ethan appeared distracted by the anticipation. As Naomi approached the front section reserved for distinguished guests, she glanced toward the stage. The enormous screen behind the podium remained dark. The mystery remained hidden. For now, she took a slow breath. Something felt different about tonight. Not dangerous, not threatening, simply different. And somewhere beyond the conversations, beyond the smiles, beyond the polished appearances and expensive jewelry. A truth that had remained hidden for years was quietly waiting for its moment to step into the light. Victoria Monroe enjoyed attention the way some people enjoyed sunlight. The more she received, the more she seemed to need. Standing beside the reserved seating area near the front of the ballroom, she accepted compliments with effortless confidence while donors and socialites gathered around her. Several guests smiled whenever she spoke. Others laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. Nobody seemed eager to challenge her. After all, Victoria had become a familiar presence around Ethan Carter. That alone carried value. From across the room, Naomi noticed the dynamic immediately. Not because she was jealous, not because she felt threatened, because she had spent years observing people. And people often revealed more than they intended. She continued walking toward the front section. The reserved seats were positioned directly before the stage beneath a large arrangement of white orchids and golden lighting. Each chair carried a name card. The most distinguished guests would sit there during the evening's major announcement. Naomi approached calmly. Conversations continued around her. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Music drifted through the ballroom. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Then Victoria stepped forward. The movement was subtle, deliberate, impossible to mistake. Several nearby guests immediately fell silent. The shift in atmosphere happened almost instantly. Victoria glanced at the name card resting on the chair Naomi was approaching. Then she smiled. It was a beautiful smile. The kind that looked warm from a distance. The kind that felt very different up close. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. Her voice carried just far enough for nearby tables to hear. "I think you're mistaken." Naomi paused. For a brief moment, neither woman spoke. A few guests turned toward them. Others pretended not to watch while listening carefully. Naomi's expression remained calm. "Am I?" she asked gently. Victoria nodded. Then came the sentence. The sentence that would eventually travel across the ballroom. The sentence that would be repeated long after the gala ended. "That seat isn't yours." The surrounding conversations seemed to fade. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for people to notice. Enough for people to listen. Several guests exchanged curious glances. One woman raised an eyebrow. A businessman quietly lowered his champagne glass. Naomi looked at the chair, then at Victoria. "I see." That was all she said. No anger. No argument. No embarrassment. Victoria appeared almost disappointed by the response. Perhaps she had expected resistance. Perhaps she had expected a scene. Instead, Naomi simply stood there, composed, unshaken. Victoria crossed her arms lightly. The front section is reserved for foundation leadership and special guests. A few people nodded as though the explanation sounded reasonable. One donor whispered something to his wife. Another guest looked at Naomi with polite uncertainty. The assumptions began immediately. Who was she? Had she made a mistake? Did she belong there? Naomi recognized the expressions. She had seen them before. Many times. People rarely asked questions when assumptions felt easier. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained surrounded by investors discussing a recent acquisition. He could not hear what was happening. He had no idea that attention was quietly shifting toward the front row. Victoria gestured toward a table farther back. "There are several available seats over there." Her tone remained perfectly polite. That made it worse. Because cruelty wrapped in politeness often traveled farther than open hostility. The surrounding guests watched carefully, waiting, judging, wondering. Naomi noticed all of it. The curiosity, the whispers, the silent calculations happening behind expensive smiles. For a brief moment, she looked toward the stage. The giant screen remained dark. The announcement had not started yet. Whatever was coming tonight remained hidden. Then she returned her attention to Victoria. "You seem very certain," Naomi said. Victoria smiled again. "I am." The confidence in her voice drew another wave of whispers. Someone quietly chuckled. Another guest leaned closer to hear better. Naomi studied the younger woman for a moment. Not with anger, not with resentment, with something closer to understanding. Because truly confident people rarely felt the need to prove their importance. Victoria mistook the silence for surrender. Her smile widened. The people around her seemed increasingly comfortable taking her side. Status had a powerful influence, especially in rooms like this. Finally, Naomi nodded. Then she did something nobody expected. She picked up her place card, turned away from the confrontation, and calmly walked toward another table. The reaction was immediate. Victoria relaxed. Several guests assumed the matter was settled. A few even smiled approvingly. From their perspective, the awkward misunderstanding had been resolved. What they failed to realize was that Naomi had not moved because she believed Victoria. She had moved because some truths did not need defending. Not yet. As she took a seat farther back, a strange feeling settled over the ballroom. The incident was over. Yet somehow it did not feel finished. Several guests continued glancing toward Naomi. Others returned to their conversations. Victoria resumed accepting attention. The music continued. The champagne continued flowing. The gala continued moving forward. But somewhere beneath the glittering surface of the evening, unseen by nearly everyone in the room, the first crack had already appeared. And before the night was over, that single crack would become impossible to ignore. Naomi settled quietly into her new seat. The table sat farther from the stage, farther from the cameras, farther from the people who seemed convinced that proximity to power somehow created importance. None of it bothered her, at least not on the surface. She placed her evening clutch beside her plate and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. The ballroom gradually returned to its previous rhythm. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned. Music drifted softly from the string quartet positioned near the stage. To most guests, the uncomfortable moment had already passed. But not entirely. The incident had left behind whispers. And whispers had a habit of traveling. At the front of the ballroom, Victoria Monroe found herself surrounded by renewed attention. Several guests congratulated her on handling what they assumed had been an awkward misunderstanding. Others seemed impressed by the confidence she displayed. Victoria accepted every compliment gracefully. The attention suited her. Nearby, a prominent donor leaned toward her. "You handled that very professionally." Victoria smiled modestly. "I simply wanted to avoid confusion." The donor nodded approvingly. Of course. Neither of them noticed several people exchanging uncertain glances nearby. Not everyone had felt comfortable watching what happened, but few people were willing to challenge it, especially when the room appeared to have already chosen a side. Across the ballroom, Ethan Carter finally stepped away from a discussion involving investors from California. The conversation had lasted nearly 40 minutes. Acquisitions, expansion plans, market forecasts, the usual subjects that followed billionaires wherever they went. As he moved through the crowd, people continued stopping him. A handshake here, a photograph there, a brief conversation with a senator, another with a university president. The evening seemed determined to keep him occupied. Eventually, Victoria appeared beside him. Her timing felt almost effortless. "Busy evening?" she asked with a smile. Ethan laughed softly. "When are they not busy?" Victoria glanced toward the ballroom. The foundation certainly knows how to attract attention. Ethan followed her gaze. His eyes briefly moved across the tables. For a moment, he spotted Naomi seated farther back. A small crease appeared between his brows. Normally, she sat near the front. Before he could think more about it, Victoria continued speaking. Several guests approached. Another conversation began. The moment passed. Meanwhile, Naomi remained perfectly calm. A younger woman seated nearby eventually leaned toward her. "I'm sorry if this sounds strange." Naomi smiled. "Most interesting conversations begin that way." The woman laughed nervously. "I noticed what happened earlier." Naomi waited patiently. The woman lowered her voice. "You handled it better than I would have." A faint smile touched Naomi's lips. Sometimes peace is more valuable than being right. The woman considered that answer carefully. Before she could respond, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The effect was immediate. Conversations softened. Hundreds of guests instinctively turned toward the stage. Something was beginning. Excitement spread through the room. For weeks, rumors had surrounded tonight's announcement. Nobody seemed certain what would happen, but everyone wanted to witness it. At the front of the ballroom, Victoria straightened slightly in her chair. Her confidence seemed stronger than ever. Several people around her appeared equally excited. One executive leaned toward another. "I heard the foundation is naming a successor tonight." The other man nodded. "I heard the same thing." A woman seated nearby joined the conversation. Apparently, the decision affects future leadership. The speculation grew quickly. Every table seemed to have its own version of the story. Some expected a new chairman. Others expected a historic donation. A few believed the foundation planned a national expansion. Nobody actually knew. That uncertainty only increased the anticipation. Ethan glanced toward the stage. Even he appeared curious. As one of the foundation's most recognizable public figures, people often assumed he knew everything. The truth was more complicated. Several foundation matters operated independently. Certain decisions remained confidential until official announcements. Tonight was one of those nights. The giant screen behind the stage slowly illuminated. A soft golden glow filled the ballroom. The room immediately fell quieter. Guests leaned forward. Phones appeared. Cameras activated. Near the front row, Victoria sat with visible confidence. She looked exactly like someone expecting good news. Across the room, Naomi remained calm. Almost unusually calm. One elderly philanthropist seated nearby happened to notice. He studied her for several seconds. Then he quietly asked the person beside him, "Why does she look like she's already heard the announcement?" The other man followed his gaze. Naomi sat perfectly composed. No anxiety, no excitement, no curiosity, only quiet certainty. The observation lingered in his mind, because everyone else in the room appeared eager to discover what was about to happen. Everyone except her. At that exact moment, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Applause echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. The evening's most important moment had arrived. And although nobody realized it yet, the truth hidden behind tonight's announcement was already moving toward the center of the room. One revelation at a time. The applause continued as the master of ceremonies stepped to the center of the stage. The enormous screen behind him glowed gold. Crystal chandeliers reflected the light across the ballroom. For a brief moment, the room felt suspended between expectation and reality. Everyone was waiting. Everyone wanted answers. The master of ceremonies smiled warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight." More applause followed. The Carter Foundation has spent decades supporting education, healthcare, community development, and opportunities for families across the country. Images began appearing on the giant screen. Schools, scholarship recipients, medical centers, community programs. Thousands of lives touched by the foundation's work. Guests watched with admiration. Several donors nodded proudly. Others lifted phones to record the presentation. At the front table, Victoria Monroe sat elegantly beside Ethan Carter. She looked exactly where she believed she belonged. Important, visible, admired. Across the ballroom, Naomi watched quietly. Her expression never changed. The elderly philanthropist who had noticed her earlier continued observing from across the room. The more he watched, the more curious he became. Nobody remained this calm during a major announcement unless they already knew something, or unless they were somehow connected to it. On stage, the presentation continued. The Carter Foundation began with a vision. Photographs appeared. Early fundraising events. Small community gatherings. Old newspaper articles. Images from nearly 20 years earlier. Several guests leaned forward. Few people had ever seen the Foundation's earliest history. Most assumed Ethan had built everything himself. That was the public story. The simple story. The story people preferred. On the screen, a younger Ethan appeared in one of the photographs. The room smiled. The image showed him speaking at a modest charity event long before his billionaire success. Beside him stood several volunteers. Faces blurred by time. People barely noticed them. Their attention remained fixed on Ethan until the next image appeared, and then another, and another. A few guests began exchanging glances. Something unusual was happening. The same woman kept appearing. Different years, different locations, different projects, yet always there, standing nearby, working behind the scenes, helping organize events, meeting families, greeting donors, reviewing plans. The woman appeared again and again throughout the Foundation's history. A guest near the front narrowed his eyes. "Who was that?" Another guest leaned closer to the screen. "I was wondering the same thing." Victoria remained unconcerned. The woman in the photographs looked familiar, but she paid little attention. Her focus remained on the stage and on Ethan. Meanwhile, Ethan himself had begun noticing the pattern. The photographs continued. Year after year, event after event, the same woman appeared. His expression slowly changed. Recognition stirred. Not fully, not yet, but something felt strangely familiar. The master of ceremonies continued. Many people know the public face of the Carter Foundation. The screen displayed photographs of Ethan receiving awards, business magazines, television interviews, public ceremonies. The audience applauded. Then the presenter smiled. But tonight is not. About the public face. The applause gradually faded. Confused silence replaced it. Victoria straightened slightly. Several donors exchanged uncertain looks. The presenter continued. Tonight, we honor a story that very few people know. The room grew quieter. Because every great institution has visible leaders. A pause. And every great institution has someone who quietly carries the foundation beneath it. The words seemed to land differently throughout the ballroom. Some people looked puzzled. Others appeared intrigued. Across the room, Naomi remained still. Calm. Patient. Certain. The screen changed again. This time the image showed foundation documents. Original planning records. Old meeting notes. Handwritten pages. Historic photographs. The earliest years of the organization. Guests watched with growing curiosity. The presenter spoke carefully. When the Carter Foundation was first established, one individual dedicated countless hours building its programs, organizing its outreach efforts, and helping shape its mission. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Victoria's confidence finally wavered. Only slightly, but enough, because she suddenly realized the presentation was moving somewhere unexpected. Beside her, Ethan stared at the screen. His attention had become absolute. The room no longer existed. Only the images. Only the memories. Only the growing realization that perhaps the story he had spent years believing was incomplete. The presenter continued. For decades, this individual refused recognition. Another image appeared. The same woman, older now, standing beside families helped by foundation programs. Listening, working, smiling, never seeking attention, never standing in front, always standing behind, helping others shine. The ballroom had become completely silent. No conversations, no whispers, no movement, only anticipation. Then the presenter spoke the words that changed everything. Tonight, we finally tell the true story of one of the foundation's original architects. A collective breath seemed to pass through the room. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Ethan leaned forward. Across the ballroom, Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward the stage. And for the first time all evening, a faint knowing smile appeared on her face. The secret behind the foundation was no longer hidden. And in just a few moments, the entire ballroom would learn exactly whose story they had been watching. The ballroom remained completely silent. Hundreds of eyes stayed fixed on the giant screen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The anticipation had become almost unbearable. On stage, the master of ceremonies allowed the moment to breathe. Then he smiled. And now, we would like to share something very special. The screen faded to black. A single title appeared. The beginning. Soft music filled the room. Not dramatic. Not triumphant. Something simpler. Something personal. The first video clip appeared. A small community center. Nearly 20 years earlier. The footage was grainy. Unpolished. Real. Several volunteers moved tables and unpacked supplies. Young families waited in line. Children laughed in the background. And there she was. The same woman from the photographs. Younger. Focused. Working long before the cameras arrived. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. People leaned forward, trying to see more clearly, trying to understand. The video continued. Another location. Another year. Another community project. Again, the same woman appeared. Organizing volunteers. Helping families. Reviewing documents. Preparing events. Always working. Always moving. Never standing in the spotlight. At the front table, Ethan stared without blinking. His chest felt strangely tight. Because now he recognized her completely. Naomi. The woman in every photograph. The woman in every video. His wife. Across the ballroom, Naomi remained calm. But for the first time, people had begun looking at her. Not casually. Not politely. Carefully. As if they were suddenly seeing someone they had overlooked for years. The video continued. The years passed across the screen. Project after project. Campaign after campaign. Scholarship programs. Community outreach initiatives. Fundraising drives. Emergency relief efforts. Every major milestone carried one familiar presence. Naomi. Then a new voice appeared in the video. An elderly foundation board member. Recorded years earlier. He smiled warmly into the camera. Most people think great organizations are built by famous leaders. The audience listened closely. They are not. He paused. They are built by people willing to do the work when nobody is watching. The screen showed Naomi sorting paperwork late at night. Reviewing proposals. meeting community leaders, visiting program sites. The board member's voice continued. For years, Naomi Carter refused every opportunity for recognition. More images appeared. Awards she never accepted. Interviews she declined. Press opportunities she quietly passed to others. The audience exchanged surprised looks. Nobody had known any of this. Not even many longtime donors. Another board member appeared. This time a woman. Her voice carried emotion. When funding was uncertain, Naomi found solutions. Images flashed across the screen. Emergency meetings. Budget reviews. Community visits. When programs were at risk, Naomi protected them. More images. More records. More proof. When people needed help, Naomi was usually the first person there and the last person to leave. The ballroom had become completely captivated. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. No one wanted to miss a second. At the front table, Victoria felt her confidence slipping away. The room's attention had shifted. Not toward wealth. Not toward status. Not toward appearances. Toward Naomi. And she hated it. Because every passing minute made one thing clearer. The woman she had dismissed. The woman she had ordered away from the front row. The woman she had treated as insignificant. Was becoming the center of the entire evening. Victoria glanced around. People were no longer looking at her. They were looking across the room. Toward Naomi. Ethan noticed it too. For the first time all evening, he turned completely in his chair. His eyes found Naomi immediately. She sat exactly where Victoria had sent her. Far from the stage. Far from the front row. Far from where she belonged. A feeling of shame began rising inside him. Small at first, then growing. Because he remembered seeing her moved. He remembered noticing. And doing nothing. The realization landed. Heavily. On screen, the final portion of the video began. The music softened. The images slowed. Years of service passed before the audience. Years of sacrifice. Years of leadership hidden behind humility. Then one final interview clip appeared. This time, it was the foundation's original chairman. The room listened carefully. His voice was older now. Gentle. Certain. The truth is simple. He smiled. There would be no Carter Foundation without Naomi Carter. The words hit the ballroom like thunder. Gasps echoed across the room. Several people actually sat forward in shock. Others covered their mouths. Some immediately turned toward Naomi. Victoria froze. Completely froze. Ethan felt his stomach drop. The chairman continued. Many people helped build this foundation. A pause. But Naomi was one of its original architects. The screen faded. The room remained silent. Not because people were confused. Because they were stunned. Everything they thought they knew had suddenly changed. And then, as the lights brightened slightly, the master of ceremonies stepped forward once more. His smile was unmistakable. Ladies and gentlemen. He looked directly toward the back of the ballroom. Toward Naomi. Please join me in welcoming the woman whose story has shaped this foundation for nearly 2 decades. Every eye in the room followed his gaze. Straight to Naomi Carter. And for the first time that evening, the spotlight found her. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire ballroom remained frozen beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Every eye was fixed on Naomi Carter. The spotlight rested gently on her. Not because she had asked for it. Not because she had demanded attention. Because the truth had finally found her. Naomi slowly rose from her chair. The movement was simple, graceful, quiet. Yet somehow it commanded the attention of every person in the room. Guests instinctively stepped aside as she began walking toward the stage. The same guests who had ignored her earlier. The same guests who had watched Victoria send her away from the front row. The same guests who now looked at her with entirely different eyes. Respect had replaced curiosity. Admiration had replaced assumption. And Victoria noticed every second of it. Her smile had vanished. Her confidence had vanished. The room she had controlled all evening no longer belonged to her. On stage, the master of ceremonies extended his hand. Naomi stepped beside him. A wave of applause began somewhere near the back of the ballroom. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the applause spread throughout the entire room. People stood, one table after another. A standing ovation. Not rehearsed. Not requested. Earned. Naomi looked across the crowd. Her expression remained calm. But deep inside, emotions she had carried for years began rising. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter. Something stronger. Relief. The applause continued. Nearly a full minute passed before the room finally settled. The master of ceremonies smiled. Naomi, tonight we celebrate a story that should have been told long ago. The audience applauded again. Then he turned toward the giant screen behind them. We have one final document to share. A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. One final document? People exchanged confused looks. The screen illuminated once more. A scan page appeared. Old. Official. Bearing the original formation documents of the Carter Foundation. The ballroom became silent again. Several attorneys and business executives immediately recognized what they were looking at. This was not a tribute. This was evidence. The master of ceremonies continued. When the Carter Foundation was established, its founding leadership was recorded here. Names appeared on the screen, one after another. Board members, community leaders, early donors. Then the final name appeared. The room collectively inhaled. Naomi Carter. Not listed as a volunteer. Not listed as a supporter. Not listed as a contributor. Listed as a founding architect and permanent governing trustee. Gasps spread throughout the ballroom. People stared at the screen, then at Naomi, then back at the screen again. Victoria's face lost all color, because suddenly the evening's humiliation returned to her. Except now everything had changed. She had ordered Naomi away from a section reserved for foundation leadership, but Naomi had not merely belonged in that section. She belonged at the center of it. The master of ceremonies allowed the realization to settle. Then he delivered the final blow. The reserved front row seat assigned tonight was not intended for a donor. Silence. It was not intended for a sponsor. More silence. It was reserved for Naomi Carter. The room exploded with shocked reactions. Several guests openly covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Across the ballroom, whispers spread like wildfire. Victoria could no longer look at anyone. Her humiliation had become complete. But Naomi never looked toward her. Not once. Because this night was no longer about Victoria. It was about truth. At the front table, Ethan felt as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. His heart pounded. Because for years he had believed he understood the foundation's history. Now he realized how much he had never fully seen. How much Naomi had protected. How much Naomi had built. And how much credit she had quietly allowed others to receive. The screen changed once more. Another document appeared. This one even older. The original charter amendment. The audience listened carefully as the master of ceremonies spoke. There is one more fact very few people know. The room became completely still. The foundation's governing structure grants one individual ultimate authority over major decisions. Every executive in attendance immediately understood the significance. Ultimate authority. Final approval. Control. The master of ceremonies smiled toward Naomi. For nearly 2 decades, that authority has belonged to Naomi Carter. The ballroom erupted. People stood again, louder than before, longer than before. The realization spread through the crowd like electricity. Naomi was not simply part of the foundation. She was one of the people who had shaped it, protected it, guided it, for years. And somehow she had never used that power to elevate herself. The applause thundered through the room. Naomi stood quietly beneath the spotlight, dignified, composed, unshaken. Meanwhile, Ethan sat motionless, 1,000 memories flooding his mind. Late nights, missed, vacations, community meetings, phone calls, sacrifices he had barely noticed. And for the first time all evening, he understood something that made his chest tighten. The woman standing on that stage had never needed his status, never needed his wealth, never needed anyone's permission to belong. She had belonged from the very beginning. And as the applause continued shaking the ballroom walls, Ethan realized the evening's greatest revelation was still waiting to come. The applause did not fade quickly. It rolled through the ballroom like a storm. Naomi Carter stood beneath the spotlight, composed and still, while the truth settled over every table. For nearly 2 decades, she had carried authority without arrogance, power without display, influence without needing applause. And Ethan Carter finally understood that he had been standing beside a woman he had never fully known. Not because Naomi had hidden herself, because he had stopped looking. That realization struck harder than the documents on the screen, harder than the gasps, harder than the standing ovation. Ethan looked at her and remembered the early years. The tiny apartment, the unpaid bills, the nights when his business dreams felt impossible. He remembered Naomi sitting at their kitchen table with a notebook, helping him organize donor calls when he had no staff. He remembered her reviewing proposals while dinner went cold. He remembered her telling him, "Build something that helps people, Ethan. Wealth without purpose will never be enough." At the time, he thought she was encouraging him. Now he understood. She was shaping him. The master of ceremonies stepped back slightly, allowing another speaker to approach the podium. An older woman walked forward. Evelyn Brooks, a respected community leader. A woman many donors knew, but few recognized as one of Naomi's earliest mentors. Evelyn looked at Naomi with pride before turning to the room. "There are stories people celebrate," she said softly. "And there are stories people survive." The ballroom fell silent again. Ethan leaned forward. Every word suddenly mattered. Evelyn continued. "When this foundation was young, there were moments it should have failed." Images appeared behind her. Old newspaper clippings, financial statements, letters from families, community centers that had nearly closed. There were years when funding disappeared. A pause. There were nights when Naomi Carter used her own savings to keep programs alive. The room reacted quietly. A few guests whispered. Others turned toward Naomi with new disbelief. Ethan's face tightened. Her own savings. He had not known. Evelyn continued. There were meetings she attended after working all day. More images appeared. Naomi in conference rooms. Naomi at school events. Naomi walking through neighborhoods in simple clothes, listening to mothers, teachers, pastors, volunteers. She did not arrive with photographers. Evelyn's voice grew firmer. She arrived with questions, with notebooks, with solutions. Ethan stared at the screen. Each image felt like a memory he should have protected. Each sentence exposed another year he had missed. Then another document appeared. A private letter, written years earlier, signed by Naomi. Evelyn read a portion aloud. "I do not need my name on the building. I only need the doors to stay open." The room went completely still. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. Not from shame, from memory, because she remembered that night. She remembered writing those words at 3 a.m. after the foundation nearly lost its first community center. She remembered choosing silence because children needed help more than she needed credit. Ethan remembered that same year differently. He had thought his business instincts had saved everything. He had accepted praise. He had smiled for photographs. He had thanked donors. But Naomi had been the one holding the foundation together. A painful truth opened inside him. He had not simply overlooked her. He had benefited from her silence. The screen changed again. This time it showed a timeline. Year by year. Decision by decision. Program by program. Every major expansion carried Naomi's recommendation. Every crisis carried her signature. Every rescue effort carried her approval. The missing years were no longer missing. They were standing in front of him. Clear. Documented. Undeniable. Ethan's breathing grew shallow. Victoria sat rigid beside him, unable to hide her discomfort. She had spent the evening pretending to belong near power. But Naomi had been power long before Victoria entered the room. Evelyn looked toward Ethan now. Not cruelly. Not accusingly. Simply truthfully. Sometimes the person who builds the room is the last person invited to sit in it. A heavy silence followed. Ethan lowered his gaze. That sentence found him. Because tonight, Naomi had not been denied by strangers alone. She had been denied while he sat close enough to stop it, and did not. The shame became unbearable. Slowly, Ethan pushed back his chair. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. He stood. For once, no cameras mattered. No reputation mattered. No image mattered. Only Naomi. He walked toward the stage, each step carrying the weight of every year he had misunderstood. The room watched him. Victoria watched him. Naomi watched him too. Calm. Unreadable. Ethan stopped at the foot of the stage. For a moment, he looked like the billionaire everyone knew. Then that mask broke. His voice was low, rough. "Naomi." The microphone caught his voice. The whole ballroom heard him. "I thought I knew what you gave." He swallowed hard. "But I never knew what it cost you." Naomi said nothing. The silence between them was deeper than any applause. Ethan looked at the woman he had failed to defend. The woman he had failed to honor. The woman whose quiet strength had carried more than his name ever had. And for the first time, he had no speech prepared. No excuse ready. No title strong enough to protect him from the truth. Only regret. And the entire ballroom waited to see what Naomi Carter would do next. The ballroom waited. No one moved. No one spoke. Hundreds of people sat beneath crystal chandeliers, watching a moment that no amount of money could control. Naomi Carter stood on the stage. Ethan Carter stood below it. And between them sat 15 years of memories. 15 years of sacrifices. 15 years of things left unsaid. The silence stretched. Not awkward. Not empty. Powerful. Because for the first time that night, nobody cared about the foundation. Documents. Nobody cared about the donors. Nobody cared about the headlines that would be written tomorrow. They cared about Naomi, the woman they had overlooked, the woman they had underestimated, the woman who had quietly built part of the world around them. Ethan looked up at her. His eyes carried something guests had never seen before. Humility. The billionaire who always had answers now stood speechless. The billionaire who controlled boardrooms now struggled to find words. And Naomi saw it. She saw the regret, the guilt, the realization. But she also saw something else. The truth. At last. Slowly, Naomi stepped closer to the microphone. The room became even quieter. "If you're waiting for me to punish someone," she said softly, "you'll be disappointed." A ripple moved through the audience. Victoria lowered her eyes. Several guests exchanged glances. Naomi continued. "Life has already done enough teaching. No anger. No revenge. No bitterness. Just calm. The kind of calm that comes from surviving things nobody else understands." Ethan felt every word. Because Naomi was giving him something he did not deserve. Grace. Again. The same grace she had offered him for years. The same grace he had often taken for granted. Naomi looked across the ballroom. Toward the volunteers. Toward the teachers. Toward the families whose lives had been changed by the foundation. This was never about a seat. She smiled gently. It was never about recognition. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Because they finally understood. The front row seat. The humiliation. The applause. None of it mattered to Naomi the way it mattered to everyone else. What mattered was the work. Always the work. The master of ceremonies stood silently at the side of the stage. Even he seemed emotional now. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man near the front stood up. Slowly. Carefully. A former community director. One of the foundation's earliest partners. He looked toward Naomi and began applauding. Again. One person. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of people were standing. Then hundreds. The entire ballroom rose to its feet. A second standing ovation. Louder than the first. Longer than the first. More emotional than the first. People were not applauding the founder. They were not applauding the trustee. They were not applauding the architect. They were applauding the woman. Naomi Carter. A woman who had spent years helping others stand. Now an entire ballroom stood for her. The applause continued. And continued. And continued. Some guests cried openly. Others smiled through tears. Even board members who had worked with Naomi for years seemed overwhelmed. Because seeing the truth and understanding the truth were not the same thing. Tonight they finally understood. Ethan remained standing beneath the stage. The sound surrounded him. Every clap reminded him of what Naomi had earned. Every clap reminded him of what he had failed to see. And yet Naomi never looked victorious. She never looked proud. She simply looked peaceful. As if the weight she had carried for years had finally been set down. Then the chairman approached the microphone. His voice trembled slightly. "There is one final announcement." The applause slowly faded. Curiosity spread through the room. The chairman smiled. "Many of you know Naomi Carter as a founding trustee." He paused. "Very few of you know that 5 years ago she quietly declined a proposal to rename this organization after herself." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Several board members nodded. It was true. The chairman continued. "She refused because she believed no mission should revolve around one person." More silence. More disbelief. The room seemed incapable of being surprised anymore. And yet Naomi kept surprising them. She asked that every dollar go toward expanding educational programs instead. Another wave of emotion swept across the audience. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. 5 years ago, he remembered that proposal. He remembered voting in favor of it. He remembered Naomi rejecting it. At the time, he thought she was being modest. Now he understood. She genuinely never wanted the spotlight. The chairman smiled again. "But tonight, we are honoring her anyway." He reached beneath the podium and lifted a framed plaque. Gold. Elegant. Simple. The inscription appeared on the giant screen. "For a life of service, leadership, and quiet courage." The ballroom erupted once more. People stood taller, applauded harder, cheered louder. Naomi accepted the plaque with both hands. For the first time all evening, emotion appeared in her eyes. Not pride, not triumph. Gratitude. She looked across the room. At friends. At strangers. At lives touched over decades. Then her gaze settled on Ethan. Only Ethan. The applause continued around them. But suddenly it felt distant. Like background noise. Because there was still one conversation unfinished. One truth still waiting. One chapter neither of them had faced. And as Naomi held the plaque against her heart, Ethan realized that winning back respect from the world might be possible. Winning back Naomi's trust would be something else entirely. The applause eventually faded. Every standing ovation ends. Every speech ends. Every celebration ends. But some truths remain. Naomi Carter stood beneath the lights holding the plaque against her chest. The ballroom slowly settled back into their seats. Conversations remained quiet. Respect lingered in the air. The room had changed. Not because of what Naomi had revealed. Because of what everyone had finally seen. The woman they thought stood behind greatness had always been part of it. The woman they assumed depended on power had quietly created it. And now there was nothing left to prove. The chairman thanked the guests. The program officially concluded. People began gathering near the stage. Donors, board members, community leaders, volunteers. They all wanted a moment with Naomi. A handshake, a photograph, a conversation, a chance to tell her thank you. For years they had benefited from her work without knowing the full story. Tonight they wanted her to hear their gratitude. Naomi welcomed each person with the same warmth, the same patience, the same grace. She listened more than she spoke, just as she always had. Across the room, Victoria Monroe quietly collected her purse. For the first time all evening, nobody was paying attention to her. No cameras followed her. No guests gathered around her. No one asked for her opinion. She slipped toward the exit. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply forgotten. And somehow that felt fitting. Because this night had never belonged to her. It belonged to the woman she had tried to embarrass. The woman who never needed the seat in the first place. Ethan remained where he was. Watching. Waiting. Uncertain. That feeling was unfamiliar to him. For years people had waited for his approval. Tonight, he was the one waiting. Eventually the crowd around Naomi began to thin. One by one, guests departed. One by one, conversations ended. Until finally there was only a small distance separating Naomi and Ethan. No audience. No applause. No cameras. Just the two of them. The way it should have been all along. Ethan approached carefully. Not as a billionaire. Not as a public figure. Just as a man carrying regret. For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Gentler. Sadder. Honest. Ethan glanced at the plaque in her hands. You deserved this years ago. Naomi smiled faintly. Maybe. Her answer surprised him. No bitterness. No accusation. Just acceptance. Ethan looked down. I keep thinking about everything I missed. Naomi studied him quietly. The truth was always there, Ethan. The words were not cruel. That made them hurt even more. Because she was right. The truth had always been there. In the long nights. In the sacrifices. In the community centers. In the programs. In the lives changed. He simply stopped paying attention. For years he had chased growth. Expansion. Recognition. Success. And somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing the person who helped build it with him. Ethan swallowed hard. I am sorry. 3 simple words. Words he should have said long ago. Naomi looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time that night, she saw no pride. No ego. No defense. Only sincerity. The apology was real. But apologies and healing were not the same thing. Both of them knew that. After a moment, Naomi nodded. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because forgiveness is not always a speech. Sometimes it is simply acknowledging the truth. The ballroom staff began dimming the lights. The evening was ending. Outside, Manhattan glittered beyond the tall windows. The city moved forward. As cities always do. Naomi walked toward the exit. Ethan matched her pace. Not leading. Not following. Simply walking beside her. For a few moments, neither spoke. And strangely, it felt familiar. Like the early years. Before the fame. Before the wealth. Before the distance. They reached the entrance. The cool night air drifted inside. Naomi paused. She looked back once. At the ballroom. At the stage. At the front row seat that had caused so much attention. Then she smiled. Not because she had won. Not because someone else had lost. Because she understood something everyone else was only beginning to learn. Her worth had never come from a title, never from recognition, never from where she sat, and never from who stood beside her. The seat had never made Naomi Carter important. Naomi Carter had made the seat important, with quiet courage, with sacrifice, with integrity, with love. For years she had carried those things without applause, without headlines, without credit, and she would carry them long after tonight was forgotten. The city lights reflected in the glass as she stepped outside. Strong, peaceful, unshaken. The woman who never needed the seat. The woman who never needed permission to matter. The woman who had belonged from the very beginning. And as the doors closed behind her, the truth remained. Some people inherit influence. Some people marry into it. Some people chase it their entire lives. Naomi Carter built it. Quietly, patiently. And when the world finally stood for her, she did exactly what she had always done. She kept walking forward.